So with Season 0 covered, it's time to move on to the big one. The Yu-Gi-Oh show which put the franchise on the map. It's time for Duel Monsters. So there is a lot to talk about with Duel Monsters, from the lack of pre-Duelist Kingdom to the filler arcs and the smaller changes to events. Across more than 200 episodes, this show changed the way the world would view the franchise forever, changing it from a manga about a variety of games to just one, Duel Monsters. But before we begin, I have to make a confession. I've only ever watched the dub, and so this review will only cover that. Obviously either a disappointment or annoying to many of you, but given that this is one of those animes which most people will have experienced the dub only, I feel justified in reviewing something by 4Kids. Although using this line in defence will become harder as we get into the later spin-offs. So let's get this introduction over and onto the plot. So the first thing to say with Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters is it was adapted partway through the manga, and so has a very interesting opening few episodes, which has to introduce a lot while also getting on with the plot it's adapting. This is most apparent in the opening episode, which is quite messy. Now how much of this is due to it being the dub version or the original is hard to say, but given the general structure of it beyond just the 4Kidisms, it was a mess from the beginning. Episode 1 is a mix of both the manga story, which introduced both Kaiba and Duel Monsters, plus Def T, which means it's very full. In this version, Kaiba is at the school without any explanation and overhears a conversation between Yugi and pals about his grandpa's super rare card. This leads to the discovery that it is the fourth and final Blue Eyes White Dragon that Kaiba is after, and so he tries to trade for it, but fails and so soon kidnaps him. This leads to them dueling with Kaiba winning and taking the Blue Eyes, which he tears up. Following that is the iconic Yugi vs Kaiba duel, which ends with Exodia, and the first of Yugi's mind crushes. So obviously it feels like we've got at least 2 episodes of content in one here, which means it feels incredibly rushed in pace. Quite a lot of the dialogue and character dynamics make it feel like this is the end of an arc or partway through, notably when Taya draws the symbol on all of their hands while talking about how great and powerful their friendship is, then Joey talking about Yugi's puzzle, as if that's something special when at this point there is no reason for that. Following episode 1, the show does manage to feel a lot better written, ignoring all the dub dialogue. With the pacing issues mostly gone, the show mostly settles down, although there is sometimes a sense that we're missing some build-up. Episode 2 is a better episode, but I think the lack of build-up that comes from the unadapted sections of the manga makes this feel a bit out of nowhere, with Yugi's victory over Kaiba being worldwide news. Given that this defeat was originally a live event at Def T, this made sense, but the setting of a private arena makes it a bit strange how people know about it. You can stretch to Pegasus as he had plans to take over Kaiba Corp, so probably had a mole in the company. This does end up feeling like a nitpick, but how Yugi goes from zero to the top in a single episode feels a bit out of place, and means he really has nowhere else to go at times, especially when taking on people who were known to be weaker than Kaiba. Now obviously the fact he won with Exodia over skill does create tension, especially once the cards are taken away from him, but without any build-up, showing him beat the person who's considered the best in the world does hurt the stakes. I'll talk about the characters in greater depth later, but for the moment I want to talk more generally about each season and what happens in the show. So having already covered episode 1, let's talk about the rest of season 1 and the Duelist Kingdom arc. So the majority of Season 1 consists of the Duelist Kingdom tournament, which is mostly adapted from the manga, although there are some story changes when it clashes with what happened in Episode 1 against Season 0. That will become important with Kaiba. The tournament is being held by Pegasus on his private island, with it being a facade so he can duel Yugi for his puzzle. Pegasus ensures that Yugi is present by sending him a videotape, which allows them to duel, with it ending with Pegasus' win on a technicality due to the tape ending, but this gives him the opportunity to steal Yugi's grandpa's soul, which he can only get back by winning the tournament. Yugi is prepared to go alone, but Tristan and Taya sneak aboard to help him, with the one exception being Joey, who sneaks aboard but has his own reasons for trying to get on the island. Joey's motivated by his sister, who will lose her sight if he doesn't get her the money to have her surgery, and despite his lack of skill at the game, it's what pushes him forward throughout this season. When Yugi learns of Joey's plan, he gives his friend one of his 2 star chips so he can enter the tournament. Episode 3 lacks any duels and instead focuses on the characters and introduces several of the early opponents that they'll be facing, including Weevil Underwood, Rex Raptor and My Valentine. It's a bit of a restful episode which gives the audience the opportunity to prepare for what's coming, although it does feature some action when Weevil throws Exodia overboard and Joey tries to save the cards. Once on the island, things heat up with the duels beginning, and here is where I have to address the card game itself, as we have to address the weirdness of it in these early years, and the unique Duelist Kingdom rules. So at this point, the card game is played more like D&D, with the rules being incredibly vague, with it basically being if you can explain your move as logical then it works, which is how we get Yugi destroying the moon and dropping a castle on a bunch of monsters. Admittedly the rules and the questionable mechanics of the game is a video in its own right, but I have to bring it up because even though I won't really be commenting on the moves in the duels, it's important as it shows the evolution of the game within the show. Plus, as the season goes on, we'll see what happens when the duels aren't from the manga. The unique rules from the island consist of the field power bonuses, which are effectively field spells which are always active, and when monsters of certain types are put on certain fields they gain a boost in both attack and defense power, which takes them from a nice round number to some of the weirdest numbers ever seen. Admittedly this aspect of the duels tends to make it a bit hard for me to rewatch the first half of this season, as it never feels in any way consistent and messy, which takes away from the viewer's ability to follow the duels and consider what the next move could be. All but 2 duels prior to the finals will use these fields, and so it hurts a lot at the first half. Both Yugi and Joey's duels are interesting for different reasons, with Yugi's containing a lot more of the bizarre logic he makes up, while Joey show his growth and improvement as a duelist. I'd say there's more depth to Joey's duels because of this, as we get to see him going from someone who needs Yugi to hold his hand to his equal by the finals. We see Joey make a lot of mistakes in his earlier duels, or him not understanding how he should play the game due to the unique rules, but as the season proceeds he gains a lot more confidence and understands what moves will get him the win, with him eventually being able to trick his opponents into playing into his hands. Yugi's duels on the other hand don't feel like they have the same stakes as he's both the main character alongside having already beaten Kaiba. He does get some interesting duels, notably against Panic and Bakura, where the duels were on a completely different level, but most of them suffer from the problems of the field power bonuses and the D&D rules, notably the Mako duel where his monsters can hide underwater. The Bakura duel is one of the better duels because it's like the Kaiba duel, as it isn't directly from the manga, with this section of the story being a loose adaptation of the Monster World arc from the manga. The characters are trapped in duel monster cards with the general events playing out similarly, but trimmed down and based around duel monsters. With this duel being written for the show, it meant that the game was played a lot closer to the rules of the real world card game, meaning that it makes sense for the most part. This short tangent from the main story was created to introduce Bakura to the show, and it mostly works well. Better than episode 1, as the show has had chance to set stuff up before this condensed arc. It does have one problem, and that being how the characters get to meet Yami for the first time, and discover there are two Yugis, something which had already been revealed to them in the manga, but prior to the Duelist Kingdom arc. It is covered up by them thinking it was just a dream, but that ends up being a bit of a cop-out to explain away this plot point, as the show wants to hold back on that reveal. Another interesting duel is the Paradox Brothers duel, which while it does use the odd rules, it features a unique maze setting for the duel, which makes the card game different, but in a cool way. The maze interferes with the way the game is played, but not to the same extent as the special fields do. This is also the first tag duel, with Yugi and Joey working together to win, which gives us some great character moments, alongside showing how much better at the game Joey has become, with this being the duel which gives them enough star chips to get into the finals. Now while this would seem to end everything before the finals, this season does give us a twist with Kaiba. So Pegasus is after Kaiba Corp. This leads to the kidnapping of Mokuba Kaiba, who escapes and informs Yugi of the situation, after stealing his star chips and trying to get revenge. This leads to a duel between Yugi and Ghost Kaiba, as by this point it was believed that Kaiba had been killed after jumping out of a window. Well, unless it's the dub, and then they skirt around that as much as possible. Now Kaiba isn't dead, with Ghost Kaiba turning out to be the evil side of Kaiba, which Yugi sent to the Shadow Realm, which Pegasus has resurrected. The duel itself consists of Yugi trying to win, while Kaiba assists through technical means, which includes using a virus to lower the attack point of all the Blue Eyes White Dragons. As Ghost Kaiba is using Kaiba's deck, this duel is pretty good for setting up that Yugi may not be enough to defeat Kaiba one-on-one, as he needs the assistance of Kaiba to win. This is the duel which shows the story difference between the manga and the anime, as in the manga, Kaiba was in a coma following his duel with Yugi, as his heart was still rebuilding itself. Ultimately it is during the event of this duel that Kaiba recovers, but in the anime, as Kaiba was never in this coma, it means that he is off doing busy work during the duel before eventually going to the island. This section of the story works well as setup for Yugi and Kaiba's rematch, arranged by Pegasus as a test for Yugi, forcing Kaiba to duel by taking Mokuba's soul. This duel is the duel which introduces the duel disc, but in their prototype form. The duel itself is nothing too out there after the season so far, but how it ends is the standout thing. In order to win, Kaiba stands on the edge and warns Yugi that if he attacks, then the shockwave might knock him off, unless you're watching the original Japanese, in which he threatens to jump. This leads to Yugi throwing the match, but Yami does attempt to win despite this, forcing Yugi to stop him, leading to a brief arc where he has to recover from this. This arc is very short, lasting only a few episodes, but does give us a look into Yugi's fears at his other half. It isn't as good as it was in Season 0, but that's mostly due to how brief this arc ultimately is. This arc consists of Yugi having to regain his trust in Yami, which really doesn't take a lot, as most of it comes in the form of a dream, where his grandpa tells him to use the power of the puzzle, and then during his duel with Mai she pushes him. Once the two are on good terms with one another, it does feel like nothing ever happened, and it's never referenced again. On the finals themselves, there are only 3 matches, with all serving a purpose and feeling important. Yugi and Mai's duel is there to help Yugi regain his confidence and work with Yami again, which leads to their victory and prepares them to face Pegasus. Joey duels against Bandit Keith, a man who was not invited to the tournament and so stole a card which Yugi gave to Joey so he could get in the finals. This duel is the one which really shows how much he has learned across the season, with him defeating Keith who was cheating, but also managing to trick him into playing into his hands on several occasions. It's a very fun duel which demonstrates how good Joey has become. The final duel is between Yugi and Joey, which is actually an anime exclusive duel, as in the manga the two agree not to duel, with Joey getting the prize money, while Yugi gets to duel Pegasus. But I think the choice to give him a duel works much better, as although it isn't necessary at the end of the day, the duel is a great showing of how much they've grown, especially Joey, who has gone from chump to one of the best in the show. While Joey does ultimately lose, it's a victory which was hard earned, with Joey being able to counter almost all of Yugi's moves. I do have one problem with it, and that being during the first round when Yugi somewhat berates Joey for making basically the same move as him, which is to summon the monster and not play any spells or traps. I think this is more of a dub dialogue problem than the match itself, but it does annoy me. With the finals complete, Yugi duels Pegasus, which is one of the best duels in the season. Apart from the actual moves within the duel, the uphill battle itself is great as it sees Yugi having to overcome the ultimate disadvantage, that being that Pegasus is able to see into the minds of his opponents and know their every move, this being for his Millennium item, the Millennium Eye. Kaiba previously lost to Pegasus because of this, which led to his soul being taken, but it allowed Yugi time to prepare for his match. While Pegasus dominates the earlier part of the match, Yugi figures out a strategy which allows him to take the upper hand, this being the mind shuffle strategy, where him and Yami switch places with one another rather than playing together, meaning that they are able to hide their minds and therefore their moves from Pegasus. This aspect of the duel makes it fun, as having the duo gain the advantage through this technique and seeing Pegasus squirm is great. The duel goes on like this for a bit, but when Pegasus makes it a shadow game, that all changes, with Yugi being unable to duel, leaving him seemingly dead, while Yami has to fight alone. It's a great way to raise the stakes of a duel again, while it also builds on the group's friendship, as Jerry, Taya and Tristan come together to lend Yami their strength and shield his mind from Pegasus. Obviously Yami wins and Yugi isn't dead, which leads to Pegasus releasing the souls he has gathered before being confronted by Yami Bakura, who somehow returned. They battle with ancient Egyptian laser beams before Bakura takes the Millennium Eye. That mostly ends the main plot, as the remainder of this season is filler, with there being some important plot stuff here and there. Notably, Yugi and Kaiba confront each other about their last duel and tease a rematch, alongside Yugi reuniting with his grandpa. That takes up about half of an episode, with the remainder of that episode consisting of Solomon getting confronted by a character called Rebecca Hawkins, who insists that he stole her grandpa's blue eyes, but we'll get to her in the following filler in a moment, because first we need to talk about Shadi. So like with Bakura, due to Shadi's introduction being prior to Duelist Kingdom, it's just randomly added in after Pegasus' eye is stolen, with him confronting Yugi as he believes it was him who stole the Millennium Eye. This adaptation cuts out the majority of the original material, with it only featuring the scenes of Shadi in the Pharaoh's mind. This also means that the most interesting part, their battle, is completely cut, which is a massive shame, as it ultimately leaves Shadi a bit incomplete, with him just sort of being introduced rather than fleshed out. Yugi and Jerry get their rewards, with Yugi gaining the title of the King of Games. Now onto the Rebecca Hawkins duel. This duel is a fun one, with it being a Yugi duel and not a Yami duel. It ultimately doesn't matter too much, as the events of this are entirely filler, with Rebecca only showing up in other filler seasons. But it does give us the backstory of Yugi's grandpa's Blue Eyes White Dragon, with him being gifted it by Arthur Hawkins after their duel, in which Solomon purposely lost to save his friend's life. It also makes Kaiba destroying the card more powerful now we have the history. The rest of the filler isn't anywhere near as fun, as it sees Yugi and company trapped in a virtual reality game to save Kaiba. The last few episodes aren't filler, but end up feeling like it, this being the Dungeon Dice Monsters arc. And the reason it feels like filler is that it was the last time that Kazuka Takahashi wrote a non-Duel Monsters game into the story, which fits within the story of the manga in Season 0, but not Duel Monsters. The arc itself does introduce Duke Devlin, who would be pushed a lot in the anime, with him appearing throughout it. The game itself does look fun, even if it's a bit confusing, as Yami has to learn the rules on the fly, which really shows off his ability to adapt. This arc sticks out a lot in the show, as it feels out of place, as the only other game in the show is the namesake of it. In some ways there is a sense of nostalgia for Season 0 when you watch it if you're familiar with what came before, but outside of giving us Duke Devlin, that's about it. Season 2 really picks things up and brings Duel Monsters into its peak era. From the beginning of the season it feels different, with Yugi and Yami now being a duo instead of two sides of the same coin. There are many scenes in which the two talk, and this strengthens their bond, which had only recently formed. Beyond that, we also have the duels, which now use actual rules, which makes them actually followable. The introduction of these rules did cause some changes, notably introducing tribute summoning. Now not all the duels are odd logic free though, as a lot still use the D&D mechanic. The most notable example I think is during the Yugi and Strings duel, where Yugi lowers the attack point of Slifer when it's attacking, but then Revival Jam protects it because it's somehow now treated as Yugi attacking, then Strings plays a continuous spell in the battle phase, its effect activates after it should have, and then Slifer continues the attack. Yeah, it's still messy, but generally an improvement. So let's establish the threat of this season, as it changes the game big time. This season begins a strong focus on who Yami is, with the villains being directly linked to him, as they are the people who guarded his tomb and await his return. The main villain is Marek Ishtar, who wants the Pharaoh's power for himself as his life has been miserable due to being born a tomb keeper, with him creating the rare hunters to assist him in capturing the Egyptian god cards, which are a part of gaining the Pharaoh's power. This differs him a lot from Pegasus, as while both have personal stakes in the matter, the way Marek is connected to the main character is more interesting. Marek also possesses a Millennium item, the Millennium Rod, which allows for him to brainwash people onto his side, which he uses often to duel Yugi directly despite not being in Battle City for a decent chunk of the season. This also allows him to use Jerry and Taya against Yugi later in the season. Now Marek isn't immediately a stronger villain than Pegasus. While his history directly ties in with Yami, it isn't until later when he becomes truly evil, to the point where he makes what Pegasus did look kind. This is with the introduction of Yami Marek, who is completely evil, and I will talk about more when I get to Season 3, as that's when he's on full display. Although in Season 2 he does get two duels which show off his sadistic nature. So let's talk about Battle City now, as that's what the season is built around. So the Battle City is another tournament, but this time being hosted by Kaiba so he can get his hands on the Egyptian god cards. Although this is due to the intervention of Ishizu Ishtar, who told him about the god cards, which led to him making the tournament. Ishizu has her own motivations as she wants to save her brother, but is using Kaiba to achieve that end. This season ends up shaking Kaiba's character up a bit, but I'll talk about that later. But he's a lot more in the forefront this time, with him releasing the duel disc to the masses, although it has been upgraded, alongside seemingly being the guy who's made up the new rules for the game, as it's during Battle City that they change. One big shake-up is Yugi. As he and the Pharaoh are now aware of each other, the two of them basically spend the first half of the tournament as a duo, with them only seeing their friends on occasion. Joey is backed by the entire group, including Solomon, with him getting to show off how strong he's become by beating Weevil and Mako. This splits the season, as a lot of the character moments occur in the Joey section, with him not fighting for his sister this time, and instead to help Yugi, as Yugi carries the plot as he only faces rare hunters. This splitting up of the cast is interesting, and does somewhat improve the pacing and tone, as episodes switch between the two different sides instead of just who is dueling. The plot does eventually catch up with Joey, as he is captured and mind controlled by Marek, leading to one of the greatest duels in the show, when Yugi and Joey face off to the death. And oddly that's true of the dub, as there aren't any references to the Shadow Realm. I mean, they don't say death, but they don't hide it like usual. It's one of the most powerful duels in the show, as it's one of the very few times that Yugi duels without Yami. While at the same time we also get to see Joey fighting off Marek's control, showing just how strong his willpower is. The duel ends in Yugi's defeat at his own hands, and it's so powerful as he sacrifices himself for his friend, although Joey then saves him. It's a great end to this part of the season, as it shows off the character's growth alongside really establishing how evil Marek is. The finals were also strong, with someone basically dying every match. The finals were also strong as we have the three new characters of Marek, Odeon and Shizu against the finalists of Duelist Kingdom with Bakura instead of Keith. This assortment gives us many great duels, although the outcomes do feel obvious given the setup. We know Yugi and Kaiba are going to win, and that whoever faces Marek isn't claiming victory. The most intense because of this is Joey versus Odeon, as at this point Odeon is disguised as Marek, with Joey figuring him out and forcing Odeon to summon the winged dragon of Ra, which nearly kills them both. The other big reason that the Joey and Odeon duel is so strong is that it gives us a lot of the backstory of the Ishtars, as it explains how Marek's life fell apart and that Odeon was the only one keeping him both sane and safe, with him ultimately snapping, with him becoming Yami Marek. This is when the stakes increase massively, as due to Odeon falling into a coma, it means that there's nothing holding back this dark side, and he emerges just in time to duel Mai. With this introduction, the show really kicks things up and goes into probably the darkest duels in the show, as while Pegasus did know how to create a shadow duel, Yami Marek is on another level, and even in the dub, they are significantly more intense. The duel against Mai immediately shows how threatening he is, with a shadow game in which when a monster is destroyed, the duelist loses their memories of a person. Even just this tamer first duel, by comparison to what we saw with Pegasus, it feels insane. This does continue into his later duels, in a duel against Bakura, where their souls are connected to their life points, but the best of these happen in Season 3, but that we have to leave until then, as we have another filler arc. Season 3 begins with a filler arc, and it's so out of place, as while we have had some filler before, this is half a season long and takes place mid-arc. I mean, there's obviously a production reason for it, but it feels so skippable in the grand scheme of things, as nothing that happens in it carries over. So the season sort of expands on the big 5 virtual world filler arc from Season 1, as they are involved with it, but it's mostly a Kaiba arc, with him learning about his secret brother Noah Kaiba, who was the son of Gozaburo, the man who adopted Seto and Mokuba. Now this arc isn't a complete waste of time, if just for the Kaiba stuff, as we learn about their history, notably their adoption at the hands of Gozaburo, with him essentially torturing Seto as he grew up. Having the Kaiba brothers watching their history is definitely the highlight, as seeing them both struggling with the past in this way is engaging. We also spend a lot of time with Noah Kaiba, who has a very tragic past, which is basically completely botched in the dub because the details were too dark. This also carries over into his death, where the dub says he survived somehow, and we never see him again. Outside of this, the season mostly consists of duels which have the stakes of whoever loses is trapped forever. The duels aren't anything too interesting for the most part, although it does feature a unique ruling which introduces deck masters, which are monsters that give the duelist a special ability and can be brought onto the field whenever, but if they're destroyed then the duelist loses. It's a cool unique set of rules, but it only appears in this arc to spice things up a little, and will become broken when Noah duels. Speaking of the Noah duel, this is definitely an interesting one, as it begins with Kaiba versus Noah before Yugi takes over due to Kaiba being turned into stone. This duel is the peak of the duels in this arc, but it does still feel like a waste of time given this happens mid-Battle City, and nothing carries over. This arc ends with Gozaburo's return and Kaiba defeating him, but then he somehow becomes an explosion in the real world and tries to kill everyone. Yeah, putting the arc on hold here really hurts it, as the Ishtars are just sitting around not doing anything until Marek decides to kill everyone. With the filler over, it's back to the tournament, as if nothing happened, other than the change to the Kaiba called Blimp, which is now more of a large jet. The finals feature some of the best and most iconic duels in Yu-Gi-Oh! While they're not perfect in terms of plays, these are great duels, with the opening 4 duelist match that decides the duels being a fun one. This duel has quite unique rules and allows the duelists to decide who is going to duel with who in the finals. Marek wants to duel Yugi, Kaiba wants to duel Yugi, and both Yugi and Joey want to duel Marek. Joey's motivations are the most interesting, as he wants to duel as both revenge for Mai and to keep his promise to Yugi. The characters really shine here, and it makes the end result of the next duel all the more saddening. The finals themselves consist of Joey vs Marek, then Yugi vs Kaiba, with both of them being amazing, but I think Joey vs Marek does steal the show as my favourite, just for how one-sided it feels. This, like with the others, is a shadow duel, but this is probably the most deadly of them all, as when the monster is attacked or destroyed, the duelist takes the same damage as them, and when I say the same damage, they literally feel what the monster felt. Now, one of the reasons I think this is the most horrific of shadow duels is because even Marek can't stand it. Of course the dub is more tame, with it being they just have some energy drain from them, but that's far less interesting, plus it doesn't explain why Joey screams when Panther Warrior is electrocuted. Beyond that, the dub of course cut a lot of the more aggressive ones, or censored them, notably when Rocket Warrior flies through one of Marek's monsters and tears a hole in it. The high stakes of this duel really just goes to show Joey's strength, as despite everything he goes through, he is able to keep going. This leads to the final 2 turns, which are the most extreme, as after a massive amount of build-up, Marek finally summons the Winged Dragon of Ra and uses it to burn Joey alive. This is perhaps the most intense moment in the show, as even in the dub it feels so real, probably due to the animation being so strong here. But the fact that Joey survives this and comes so close to actually winning is what makes this a top tier duel. The end result of this is Joey in the Shadow Realm, or in the original, dead. Seriously, he is not breathing until they rush him to hospital. Even Marek can't stand the torture of the duel, and this is a guy who takes pleasure in it. The next duel is Yugi vs Kaiba, which coming straight off the Marek duel feels so tame. Now move wise this is definitely messy, as they constantly make some really dodgy decisions with their cards, but at the same time, both of them are obsessed with a certain endgame, that being to win with their Egyptian gods. This is probably the most iconic duel of the entire franchise. If anyone thinks of Yugi vs Kaiba, it's this duel. And yeah, while it is messy, it's an incredible watch as the two of them try and get the upper hand. Beyond just that, there is a ton of character stuff, notably with their shared history, as there are a few lore drops with Yugi and Kaiba seeing the ruins of ancient Egypt and their ancestors dueling, even if in retrospect I have no idea where this fits in the timeline. Of course Yugi wins in the most over-the-top way possible, but with his victory we get some more filler. So between the final 2 duels, there is a short stretch where Joey calls Kaiba out and they duel, with an obvious loss for Joey. Beyond that, it's mostly just re-establishing the stakes for Yugi vs Marek, and setting up the idea that Marek can be redeemed. But once it's over, the final duel begins and it's really good, but doesn't feel quite up to the previous 2. While it's not in any way bad, the Joey duel was so incredibly intense, while the Kaiba duel was one we've been waiting for a few seasons. There's just something about the final duel which doesn't hit as hard as the previous 2, but it does really push Yugi to his limits, as it's constantly an uphill battle, as Ra is so overpowered at this point in the show. Ultimately Yugi wins when Marek is able to take control again, due to Yami Marek being weakened from the banishing of Ra and the majority of his soul, with the final move being Marek surrendering. That basically wraps up Battle City, as the final episode or so is just having a few bits of information that will lead the Pharaoh to his destiny. We also have the people in the Shadow Realm being brought back, and then Kaiba blowing up the entire island without telling anyone, with them barely escaping. Now for Season 4, which is an interesting season to say the least, as it's entirely filler. So for whatever reason, another much longer filler arc was introduced to the show at this point, and it's one which seems to get a lot of love while at the same time being so out of place. The season introduces an entirely new villain who predates the Shadow Games by 5,000 years. This is in some ways interesting, but the fact that it is so disconnected from the main plot really hurts the idea to the point of pointlessness, which is a shame as there are some great things in this season. The main villain of this season is Darts, a man from Atlantis who has been alive for 10,000 years in order to revive the Great Leviathan under the command of the Orichalcos. So Darts is an interesting villain as he's a manipulator. With his long life he has been able to affect the lives of many people to get what he needs. Best demonstrated with the 3 duelists who he destroyed the lives of in order to get them to work for him. There is a big problem with Darts though, and that once the arc is finished we learn that he was brainwashed by the Orichalcos, meaning that he wasn't responsible for the thousands of lives he destroyed. Now this is definitely one of those endings which takes away from the season, as it means that there really isn't a satisfying end given that nobody is to blame, except some creature we can't comprehend. On the 3 duelists they are all interesting to a degree, but all of their backstories were basically butchered in the dub, as they had to be toned down due to them being very dark, which really hurts them as characters. Beginning with Alistair, he hates Kaiba as his brother was killed during a war where Gozaburo Kaiba was supplying the enemy, which was Darts in disguise. In the dub though, his brother was captured, which does make you wonder what Alistair has been doing this past decade, given he doesn't seem any closer to finding him. Next is Valon, whose backstory feels the most butchered because I can barely remember it. There are a ton of details which are cut out, and it takes him from being someone who was in a bad position and was framed for arson and murder to just a bad kid. Fortunately he does get the Mai stuff, which does help to fix some of this lack of interest. Dart is more closely worked into this backstory as he's connected to the prison that Valon was sent to. The final of the three is Raphael, who while has the butcher backstory, does actually have an actual arc. So his butcher backstory is when he was young, his family went on a cruise to celebrate his birthday, and on that day the ship was turned over in a storm and his family were killed, with Raphael being the only survivor and ended up on an island, where he lived for a few years before being rescued. Now the stuff on the island isn't really altered as it's quite brief, but once he's rescued the backstory falls apart as his family aren't addressed. So for whatever reason he's just alone. In the original his inheritance was taken and his extended family left him, but without that it's extremely odd that he never hunted down his family, or they never hunted him down, given that news of his return was in newspapers. This really hurts his redemption arc at the end, when he comes to peace with what happened, as without the depths of his family, it feels odd that he could come to terms with it, especially with the way it's presented. Now the pointlessness of this arc becomes clear as it goes on, as nothing matters to the rest of the show. We do get Dart using the Egyptian god cards to help provide for Leviathan, but that's just there to write them out. We also get some glimpses of the Pharaoh's backstory, but that's just Dart's view of stuff we see later on. The only thing which feels like it had any sticking power is the Pharaoh's arc, as he goes through quite a journey in this season, with him losing Yugi and nearly falling to evil. Now on the one hand the arc is kind of cool, but on the other isn't the most amazing. So with Yami's lack of memories, Raphael is able to convince him he was an evil ruler back in his time, even though there isn't any proof and instead is just being told by some guy who is actively evil. But I think it just falls a bit flat due to it not meaning anything in the grand scheme and wrapping up very quickly. But one of the best bits of this season is when Yami is recovering from the loss of Yugi. Everyone knows this by now, but Yami is defeated by Raphael and Yugi sacrifices himself to save Yami. This leaves him alone for the majority of the season and does push him to his limits at times, with the most notable occasion being when he does Weevil, and he breaks. This is the only moment after season 1 that we see season 0 Yami again, the darker side which will torture his opponents. Yeah, it's become a meme these days, but this scene is haunting to view, even more so in the original. The Joey stuff is the best though, as he gets quite a big arc with Valen and Mai. To explain this, after Battle City, Mai fell into a depression, due to her being lonely and not being viewed as a great duelist. The torture from Marek also left its scars. She soon met Valen and he took her to Darts, who brainwashed her and she became one of his duelists. Now yes, there are problems with Mai's fall, as she was the one to leave Joey and company after Battle City and then blames them, but I think it works well enough to build up Joey, and now his goal is to save her from them, and that involves defeating Valen. This gives us one of the coolest duels in the show, which is basically a punching match disguised as a card game. While the dub does its best to hide this, the duel consists of the two of them putting on armour and punching each other, and it's amazing. It's Joey's final great win, with him ending it completely exhausted. I think this is the best duel of the entire season. This doesn't end his arc though, as he next has to duel against Mai, which is nearly on the same level. While I don't like Mai's arc in this season, the effect it has on Joey which builds up to this duel nearly makes it worth it. The duel ends with Joey losing due to his exhaustion from the previous duel, which does make it a bit like his duel against Marek, but it feels distinctive. The endings are different. While Joey did lose to Marek on the edge of victory, here he still wins because Mai is freed from darts. It's sort of a bit of an inverse of the Marek duel. The final duel is between Yugi and Kaiba versus Darts, which is a cool duel, although it does suffer from the villain using too many broken cards. Kaiba loses, Yugi wins, and this leads to a big battle against the Great Leviathan, where they summon their duel monsters for real. Darts is redeemed somehow, and the season ends with a recap. Now, like with the virtual world arc from season 3, this does have some connections with the season 1 filler, as it brings back the Hawkinses, but that's about its only connections to the wider Duel Monsters universe. Pegasus does play a part in this season, having been redeemed it seems, so his redemption just kind of happens off screen, and it might be explained in the sub, but in the dub, he's just good now. Season 5 is a season split in two, or three if you're watching the DVDs. First we have a filler arc, and then the actual plot picks up again. The opening filler arc is the Kaiba Corp Grand Championship, and it's completely throwaway, even compared with the previous season. We've got a villain who adds nothing, and there isn't even any sort of character growth which Yugi and Joey had in the previous season. It does have the Hawkins in for one final time, but that doesn't save it. Joey loses his final duel, which is a nothing duel, which is just there to show how powerful the villain is. Yugi doesn't do much other than deal with several obsessives and has to save Kaiba Corp for a duel. We do get more of Kaiba's past, but it means nothing. There is also technically the Capsule Monsters arc on the DVDs, but that's its own thing and I have no plans to talk about it. Now on to the final arc, the Millennium World arc, which brings the show to its end. After a season and a half of filler, this feels climactic and finally continues the plot that we left at the end of season 3. We've got the return of Bakura as the main villain, and a battle in ancient Egypt against Zork. There are some massive changes from the manga right from the start, with the introduction of Kaiba as a main player, who in the manga didn't appear after Battle City. His use in this season though is a bit odd, as he barely feels present until the battle against Zork, with it making you wonder how much of a game Bakura got out of inviting him. Although I think his inclusion is good for both the final duel and just wrapping things up with his part in Yami's history. This is where we get all of the Pharaoh's history, and we find out what happened to him, which led to his spirit being in the puzzle. We also learn about the origins of the Millennium items themselves, which is what led to the release of Zork, the evil Bakura, also known as Thief King Bakura, and this is all censored in the dub. While the dub has changed things to its own detriment, here it really hurts Bakura's fall. This is a very different season, as there are only 3 duels throughout, with the middle section being almost entirely talking and action, where monsters do battle, but not as duel monsters, instead as captured spirits, most of which are evil. It is interesting, but definitely whiplash against the rest of the show. It's It's enjoyable but definitely not my cup of tea for a Yu-Gi-Oh season, especially in the dub where the edge has been taken off, but what it does for the important characters is great. Yami of course finds out about his history, defeats Zork again, ending the Shadow Games, and learns his true name, Atem. But Yugi also gets a lot of development as it pushes him as someone who can exist without the Pharaoh. This is most notable during his duel against Bakura, which is one of the few duels which Yugi has without Yami, but probably could have been stronger if Bakura had a better win ratio. The final stretch of the show is the final duel between Yugi and Yami, which everyone knows. It's one of the greatest and most iconic duels in the show, and demonstrates just how strong the two have gotten through their journey. Yugi finally proves he is able to exist on his own, and demonstrates that through his final move, which doubles as his acceptance for Yami to pass into the afterlife. The duel itself is great as we see so many classic monsters return, while Yugi shows off his newer card, which he uses to destroy the three gods. The scene of Yami departing for the afterlife is strong. There is a great sense of emotion as Yami leaves to rejoin the people from his original life. The final scene on the other hand isn't that great, at least in the dub, as it cuts before the wrapping up that the original version had, as it was played over the credits, which means we just end on a line from Yugi and Joey, which is fine but feels a bit underwhelming, and won't be the last time a Yu-Gi-Oh show ends on a disappointment. So let's talk about the characters now, beginning with Yugi. So Yugi's quite interesting in the show. We don't really have the extended arc about him worrying about what's happening when Yami takes over, with him not knowing about him until late into Season 1, when he nearly kills Kaiba. How the original version addressed the lack of Season 0 content I don't know, but it's a little bit confusing in the dub. Apart from that at the beginning, once the show gets going, the bond between the two of them is great, with them having to figure out how to work together. Then from Season 2 onwards we have plenty of scenes where they just talk like friends, which strengthens their bond in the way we didn't get in Season 0, as they never interacted. His arc across the entire show is both great and bad at the same time, because while it is strong at the beginning, with him taking a backseat to Yami during duels, this lack of him dueling alone and just general time with Yugi by himself does hinder it, as we don't get the greatest grasp of him by himself in the show. The final Bakura duel was crucial to establishing Yugi's growth from the earlier seasons, rather than having him just better than Yami. But seeing him defeat Yami in their duel is amazing, despite the odd build-up. His dynamic with his friends is somewhat hindered by Yami, as Teira especially has a bigger interest in him, but they are generally strong bonds, with his friendship with Joey being the strongest. On Yami there is far more to say, as he is more prominent during the show. Unlike with Season 0, this is Yami's show, as it follows his journey, which did start to take over after Duelist Kingdom. The addition of the Season 4 filler arc also helps with his focus on Yami as Yugi is mostly gone, which does give it the chance to push Yami in a new direction. The first arc that he goes through is learning to control himself, which doesn't take too long, as once the impact on Yugi has been felt, Yami just gives his word that he won't go against his wishes again. But given how big of a thing this was for Yugi, it's somewhat underwhelming and probably executed better in the original. Season 2 really kicks off Yami's main arc to find his past, which is far better handled, probably just due to the amount of time it's given. With the introduction of the Ishtars, we learn a lot about Yami's importance, but none of the key details. I do think a subtle detail which shows how prominent Yami is becoming from this point on, unlike with the previous season, where he'd only take over for duels. In this season, he is almost always the one in charge. This change-up is interesting, as it's not mentioned or ever addressed by any characters, but instead just happens. This is something which continues throughout the rest of Seasons 2 and 3. Season 5 is the big one for Yami, as we finally learn about his history. And while the season necessarily isn't the strongest due to a combination of factors, seeing his arc come to an end with him uncovering his memories and bringing his arc to an end with him going to the afterlife is both amazing and heartbreaking. It gives a perfect end to the show, seeing him finally be surpassed by Yugi. The only other character who really gets development is Joey, who goes through quite a lot towards the start, but is always given something of importance to do. Well, until the final season, which doesn't really know what to do with him. His initial arc in Duelist Kingdom is what really establishes his heart, and makes him the underdog we want to root for, with his victories feeling bigger than Yugi's because of his status as the underdog. This also makes his defeat at the hands of Yugi very painful, but getting what he needed in the end makes it all worth it. The next two seasons mix things up by making it about his friendship with Yugi rather than his family. Joey has no personal stakes or reason to enter Battle City, and in fact if Kaiba had had his way, he wouldn't have been there. But Joey enters to help his friend stop Marek, which cost him dearly on many occasions. This gives us some of his greatest moments yet, as detailed earlier, with his duel against Marek being a highlight and proving he is far more than just an average duelist, to the point that even Kaiba acknowledges his skills, although only in private. This is a turning point for Joey, as despite this being the end of his involvement in the main plot as a duelist, he does still continue to shine in the next season due to the filler arc. While Season 4 is a bit of a roller coaster at times, its use of Joey is great, with him having to save Mai from the villains. Of course he goes along to help his friend, but is accepted by the legendary dragons and uses their power not to fight the Orichalcos, but to save one person from its power. I've always considered Joey to be the strongest aspect of this season, and after my most recent rewatch with the context of the original version, he feels even stronger. But once he's been defeated by Mai, that's it for him, as Season 5 doesn't do anything for him, with him being invited to a tournament where he beats Solomon before losing to a villain and never dueling again. A very tragic end. But one thing to note is the Red Eyes Black Dragon card, a card which he won during Duelist Kingdom and for a time was his ace. During Season 2 it is taken from him game, and when Yugi gets it back, Joey refuses its return until he thinks he has proven himself worthy of it. But during Season 4 we are shown that Joey has the card again, meaning he must have proved himself worthy. The main reason this is so interesting though is that Season 3 ends on a cliffhanger of sorts, as Yugi and Joey go to Duel, leading to the theory that Yugi lost. Now there is no evidence for this, but it's one of those things that fans really like the idea of, with me included. Next we have Taya, who is quite simple, as her character's main job is to stand around and cheer for whoever is dueling. Now this doesn't make her uninteresting, but there isn't an arc for her, or much of any development. Due to this limited role, it means she doesn't get too many opportunities to do anything to affect the plot, but that's just on the surface, as her constant friendship speeches do affect things. The most notable occasion is when Yugi is dueling Pegasus, and she is the one to lead the trio to protect him, but there are other smaller moments throughout. One especially interesting thing about Taya though, is her duels, as she has a 100% win ratio. While she only duels 2 times on screen while having a few duels against Joey off screen, she canonically has won in every duel she has taken part in. Now there are definitely some asterisks to that due to the nature of the duels, with her duel against Mai definitely being in Mai's advantage, but it's so strange that she of all characters had such a consistent winning streak. Tristan is the most nothing character out of the main 4. Now there are some things that are strong about him, but he only duels once and is mostly there to either be the muscle when Joey is in need of help, or to cheer for whoever is dueling. Season 2 is his strongest, as he's mostly separated from the rest of the main characters and spends a decent chunk of time with Joey's sister, Serenity. This season also gives him a dynamic with Duke Devlin, which is turned into a love triangle and is pushed a lot in the filler arcs. This dynamic often feels more prominent than any of the dynamics with the rest of the cast. He tends to be an enjoyable character, but there's not much to say about him, although he does have a 100% lose rate as a duelist, as he loses the one duel he ever had, while Duke and Serenity still win. Now for Kaiba, who is the most static of characters ever written. Well, that's a bit of an overstatement, but he really doesn't change until the last few minutes of the show during the Yugi and Yami duel. Now that's not to say he doesn't change at all, because of course we see his evil side get destroyed in episode 1, which means when he returns later he seems somewhat nicer, but is on the quest where he can't stop and be nice. Although by season 2 he clearly has gone into full douche mode, with him creating a citywide tournament where he can get the god cards, and prove that he is the best, only to lose and not even pretend to be a good loser. I am quite mixed on his dynamic with Yugi, as it's usually a case of Kaiba hating Yugi because he's better than him and won't accept it, but will come to terms with him at the end of an arc, which happens like 3 times. His dynamic with Joey on the other hand is more consistent, as he hates him throughout, only respecting him once and that's when he's dead. I think his overuse in the anime does contribute to this problem I have with him, as with a longer time span he really should have been more trustworthy of Yugi's judgment, alongside having accepted that there are magical things happening, especially after his soul is taken. The only things that make me still like him despite this are just how over the top he is at all times. The dynamic he has with his brother Mokuba, and his dynamic with Joey, as they're both so much fun.
And anyone who's late for registration will be disqualified. Mokuba, make sure Wheeler's late.
Now I wasn't originally planning to talk about the animation, but I do want to talk about it briefly, and that's because of how varied it got. Now I'm not an expert on animation, so I'm not talking about that, but more so the fact that when the show got into the Battle City finals, there was the beginning of a bit of a drop in quality which continued into the rest of the show and got worse. Now obviously this drop in quality was to do with the movie being made alongside it, but it didn't pick up again after that, and I have to say it got worse. The quality bar had risen during Battle City, with the first half of Season 3 I considered to be the best. By this point I was able to consistently know what the next episode's style would be, as I was aware of the animator's rotation. Then suddenly during the finals there was a general drop and the routine changed. Things then changed again with Season 4, but by Season 5 the sense of the animator's rotation felt gone, and some episodes felt like they had different people doing different shots, as the quality could vary from shot to shot during a single episode. There is obviously a reason for this, but it's still jarring to see the quality suffer so much by the end of the show. So that's about it for Duel Monsters. Out of the many Yu-Gi-Oh shows, this is the one I find the hardest to watch due to its length and the filler arcs which dominate the runtime. There are definitely some problems with it beyond that, most of which coming from it being the dub I watched, but it's still great. From the characters to the duels, even with the very messy state of the game at the time, while it wasn't the show I grew up with, its impact is clear, from the prominence of the Dark Magician and the Blue Eyes White Dragon in later shows, to the brief appearance of the Eye of Widjat in the first opening of Reigns. But beyond that, its general presence in other media across the globe. While it wasn't the first Yu-Gi-Oh series, it was the one which introduced the world to it, and the card game. But we're far from done with this franchise, and even just Duel Monsters, as I still haven't talked about the original movie. This series is only just getting started, so be prepared for Pyramid of Light.